In this video, I'm filling a page in my watercolor sketchbook with a simple landscape. I'll walk you through my process in real time, sharing my thoughts, techniques, and little decisions along the way. So if you love painting loosely with watercolor, grab your sketchbook and let's have a little painting session. So I decided to tape off the page in my sketchbook here because I wanted a nice clean border and I knew I was going to be painting edge to edge with this landscape. I decided to sketch this out even though it's such a simple landscape. It's literally sky and then ground and a little bit of a silhouette in front of the sky from the grasses that are coming up from the ground. I decided to just follow the colors that I found inside of the reference photo. And if you're curious what the reference photo is, I will link it for you below if you want to look it up and use it while you're painting as well. So I'm kind of just, again, following the colors that I saw in the reference photo or close to it. And I'm mixing up a purplish blue color for the sky. I guess you could call it a blue violet. And there's a really pretty gradient going on here. And so that's what I'm going to try to achieve with the first wash. Now, I think there's something funny that happens with me when I paint is I always have tended to go lighter rather than darker. And this is definitely something I continue to work on. And with watercolor, I think, it's always said that it's a pretty general rule that you start from light to dark. And so I think that that's essentially what I do. I start light to dark. But with a gradient like this that is already dark to begin with, I sometimes wonder, should I have just gone in darker to begin with? You're going to see later on in the painting that I actually layer over this sky again to make it darker. And I do the same actually with the ground because they all started too light. Now, I don't know, I don't think with art, I guess is what I'm saying, is that there is a right or wrong way to do anything. I think there are suggested ways to do things, and perhaps it is suggested or better for me to have made this dark in one go instead of layer. But I think something that I didn't learn about watercolor until a little bit into it was that you can layer successfully, or I guess the technical term is glaze. You can glaze successfully and still maintain that feeling of fluidness that you get. Is that even a word? I don't know. Fluidity that you get from painting with watercolor, that kind of beautiful, soft look. And you can still achieve that even if you have to layer over that first wash. I think there's some really beautiful things that are already going on in the wash at this point that I think a younger me would wonder about covering up. Like, oh, that's too bad, I have to cover it up. But I think that when done right, you can still create another layer on top of this and then preserve that same feeling or find that feeling again. The fact that I'm putting in this dark area of clouds near the horizon line is a little bit funny because am I just going to cover it up is the question. I don't end up covering it up. I actually just go ahead and I glaze over it, but it's so light that you don't really see this part get covered up. So at this point, when things are wet like this, is the best time to add in things like clouds that are soft or distant to start to blend in some other colors. And if I could share a tip here for you is when you're painting at this point, when you're painting when things are wet, it's important to go in with a consistency of water to paint that's thicker than what you've put down before. So if you are using a really light watery wash for the sky and then you start to layer, or not layer, but if you start to drop in other colors on top of it, as your paper is drying, it's really easy to get cauliflowers. And that's going to happen when you use a watery mix, a more watery mix on top of the mix you already put down. So to work with something that's more creamy, thicker, has more paint in it than water, then you're not going to encroach in that danger zone, so to say. So you can see my mix here of the orange that I mixed up to pop in is thicker than that initial wash that I put in. It's so that extra water doesn't start to create backruns or cauliflowers. So I think I tend to also fuss a lot when I shouldn't. And I think that's, I would hope, is normal. I think it happens to a lot of us. But I'm fussing a bit with this dark area of the sky when I really don't need to. I think it could have been accomplished with a few confident strokes of color. But here I am, just playing. And then I discovered that there is a tiny white dot, a speck in the middle of my sky. And I'm trying to fix it. And I should know better than this, but I just went ahead with it anyway. And I think you might be wondering, why am I sharing this? Why am I revealing this mistake that I made? Because in the end, you're going to see that it gets covered up. But I also think it's really important for you to see that painting is not so fluid and easy as we might see. It's not always so one pass. Things go wrong. And in this one, they did for me too. And I'm actually going to try and fix it, and I'm going to make it worse. I tried to add a little bit of color. That's not going to work, because at this point, the background is a certain degree of dampness, and whatever I put in is not going to match what was already there. So there's no way to smooth this out, but I'm trying, and I don't know why. I think at some point I thought, you know what, maybe I'll just turn this dot into a cloud or some moon or something like that. So I'm trying different things here, and none of it is working. So it includes lifting. I'm actually taking a dry, fluffy brush and trying to smooth it out. I'm now probably trying to change this into a wispy cloud in the sky and thinking that it might work, but I don't think I'm satisfied with any of it. So in that moment when I was painting this, I thought, you know what, at one point I'm just going to give up and dry it. And once it's dry, I can layer over it. And if I layer over it dark enough, which it should have been darker anyway to begin with, if I layer over it dark enough, it will cover up this mistake. And so you're going to see I got a darker mix of the color on my palette, and I'm going over it again as if it was a first wash. Now the layer that I first put down is completely dry. I dried it with a hairdryer. And now I can go over it again without disturbing what's underneath, and also cover it up at the same time. So you're going to see as I go down towards the horizon, I'm fading it out. So it's a very light wash towards the bottom and a darker wash towards the top. So it is essentially a layered gradient, or a glazing of a gradient over what's already there, if I say that technically correct. But I'm just adding some darker colors around the top, and then I'm going to slowly fade it to clear water or a lighter wash. And I think that this successfully covered up my mistake, but it also increased the value and the darkness in the sky to create a more dynamic result, I would say. And you could see that once you've wet everything again, and as long as you're being gentle with it, it still feels like watercolor. It still has that fluid look to it. You're still going to have the gradient wash. It's still going to have that soft look to it. You can see in the lower left-hand corner that there's a little bit of a hard edge forming, and so that is something to watch out for. I think I catch it, and I think I pick up most of it, you're going to see. But while everything's wet again, so everything basically got wet again here, I can also add in some more details. So I'm taking this time to put in a bit of darker details, little marks here and there that I think needed to be put in. I'm again being a bit fussy with it, and I could see it in my strokes. They're kind of timid, a little bit afraid, and I think, maybe a future me will be more confident here. I could just go in, put in a couple of really confident strokes instead of fussing with it like this. I think when you're going back and forth with the brush like this, with watercolor, it's not necessarily a great thing. So I'm not saying do what I do. I'm actually saying don't do what I do here. Especially if you're trying to achieve a loose look with your watercolors. So it's kind of a word of, it's not warning. It's just an insight that I feel like I don't want you to follow what I'm doing. I don't necessarily think the back and forth is successful. It looks like I did not pick up that hard edge, and it's just existing in the painting. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's just like a nice little thing that happened. It kind of looks like a cloud, but it's there, and it's part of the painting. And I think that this is such a good example that watercolor can do things that you don't expect or get away from you, and sometimes they can be okay, and sometimes it can be not so good. So here's the ground that I'm putting in, and I've mixed up a teal color. I like these two colors together, so I kept it more on the turquoise side. This is a phthalo green. It's actually Viridian by Mission, I think Mission, but the pigment is phthalo green. So the pigment they use is phthalo green, but the name is Viridian. And that can get kind of confusing sometimes, but I want to tell you it's phthalo green because of the actual pigment and not because of the name. Although those two colors are quite similar, I guess, in some ways. So I've put in this turquoise green color, bluish green color, and you can see it's not dark enough. I mean, I just don't think it's as dark as it should be, and you're going to see that I will go back and darken it even more. But as I put this first wash in, and it's a nice sort of flat wash with a little bit of modeling in it or a little bit of texture, I'm going to start to refine the horizon. So I'm going to pull a couple of those shapes out, start to kind of hint that there are grasses there. And I have a little crystal on my window and it's making this rainbow on my paper. And that's what that is. I didn't add that in post-production. It's actually just a reflection. And I don't know if I just didn't notice while I was painting, but it's there and it's kind of this happy thing. I kind of like that it happened, but you're seeing that in the video at this point. So I can tell that it's not dark enough. So I am now mixing up a darker version of the color, and then I'm going to start to put in some details along the horizon line. That's really where the focus is for this painting. The sky at the top and then the foreground or the ground at the bottom, those are really lesser areas of focus. So concentrating more of the darks and then more of those tiny details, those hard line details or little details that are just smaller marks, those change where your eye looks, I feel like. So it brings the focus to the middle of the painting. And then now I'm just covering up the rest of the paper with this darker color. I didn't dry this, and that's because I know I'm going to come in again with a creamy mix, or like a very creamy mix of color, a dark color that has more paint and less water. And as I mentioned before, that's okay to do in the sense of painting wet on wet like this, because you know you're not really going to introduce any cauliflowers by accident, because the consistency of your paint that you're using is thicker than the consistency of paint you used prior to put down. So for me, I already knew that I wanted to lift out colors, number one, for the little flowers that are in this reference photo that you'll see pop up as I paint this, or if you're looking at it from downloading it. The other thing is if I needed to use white gouache, the white gouache would stand out against this darker background and just be more contrasted and have more of that pop and make more of an impact. So I think it's really good that I ended up going darker. But again, you can see that I have trouble going dark at first. It started very light and then I had to go back and mix up a darker color. Why I cannot mix up a dark color and just go in with that dark color the first time is still a wonder to me. I don't know. I don't have a good explanation for it, but if there's any case of, hey, the first pass doesn't have to be the only pass, this is a good example of that. Like I wasn't able to do it in the first pass and I had to do it again. But I think that it gives you more courage the more that you do it. I hope that I've gained courage over time to be darker, to not be afraid to go darker if I can notice that it hasn't quite succeeded that first time. So here I'm actually using that background of this bluish green to then contrast it with these darker marks of a purplish blue or a violet blue that has now been mixed into the green. And I feel like it ties the lower half and the upper half together well. And so I put in some of those marks and it kind of starts to look like texture or a little bit like grass or shadows in the grass. Now, I'm also using the same color and the very tip of my brush to put in these silhouette of some of the wheat or grass that's growing above the horizon line that you can see against the sky. You can see I'm also being quite timid here when I put in these marks. I feel like, I don't know what to say about that other than I think that when I look at my own progress, I think I've made progress and I'm more confident than I was a few years ago. But sometimes when I look back as I am now, rewatching the painting I did, I can see how I can be hesitant, and I hope that in the future I'll find that I've grown in the sense that I've gotten more confident as I've moved forward too. I don't think that I needed this many tiny little strokes. And I don't even know if I actually did anything there. I think the marks are so small. Like I want to put the marks in, but I'm also afraid to put the marks in. So I could see myself struggling with that. But you know, that's kind of how it goes, and that's how we learn. We have to experiment, and we move on, and we learn new things as we, I guess, as we paint and paint and paint. I found that lifting in this piece was really fun because it was such a dark background, and the background for the ground didn't dry yet and completely yet. And I was still able to take a damp brush. So damp brush is like I am washing the brush off in the water cup. The water cup is just above the brushes in this image. And it's damp, so I rinse it out, I dab it off. You can see I do a lot of dabbing of the brush on the paper towel, and that's to release the water, because if I put in too much water down onto the paper now, it would create cauliflowers. So it's really important when doing lifting at this stage to have a brush that's damp but has no water in it. So it's basically been wet in the cup, and then it's dried on the paper towel, so it's got moisture to it, but it doesn't have any water in it that you can release out onto the paint, because that's really what creates cauliflowers. I feel like the theme of this keeps coming back to that water to paint ratio and the timing of the background and the wetness, and how wet, that relationship between how wet is the background and how wet is your brush or your paint that you're using, because it's the play between those two that really is kind of the make or break in the appearance that happens once your brush touches the paper. So those unexpected things that happen when you get those blooms or cauliflowers, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't want that to happen. It's going to be a result of that play between how wet is the surface you're working on and what is the consistency of the paint on your brush. So I felt like this one was really fun to lift because I used a very staining pigment. So phthalo green is quite a staining pigment. And so it's going to stain the white of the paper. And I can come back and I can lift, and it creates this lighter green mark, which is kind of beautiful. I didn't do it on purpose. I didn't really plan that out. It's just how it happened. But I think it did, it went well here because I was able to get these little marks that looked like grass, and I didn't use white. In this case, I just used the lifting method, and you can kind of see the contrast. And again, very timid marks. I just cannot explain to you why I am so timid sometimes. I wish I knew. Maybe it's just experience. But at this point, I'm adding in little flowers, and it feels like it needs white gouache. So I've squeezed a bit of white gouache onto my palette, and I'm mixing it with a bit of purplish blue. That violet color from the sky, I'm hoping that I can bring it down into the flowers, because I feel like it'll tie the sky down into the ground. That was just my thought for this one. So you can see it's kind of this pastel color. And so I'm going to use that, and I'm going to keep it very, very thick because I want it to appear more opaque against the background. And I'm just going to drop in some of those flowers. It could be a variety of marks. Really, they're just kind of specks clustered together. They're not even in the shape of flowers. I think for me, I've realized that when I think about painting loose, it's about painting what's there, but abstracting the marks out. So it's not like I'm trying to make the flower form. I think I'm thinking about it like creating the essence of what's there. So a little bit of specks to represent a flower, but not getting too deep into looking at exactly what that structure looks like. I think that kind of simplification is not easy, and I'm still working on it because I can find myself diving way too deep into looking at something. And so some of the things I do when I use reference photos is I try not to zoom in, and I try to stay zoomed out. And I think it's also the scale at which I'm painting that helps. So this is a small book. I think it's a maybe 6x9 size sketchbook. And this 6x9, it's not a big area to paint in, especially after I've taped it off. So I don't have the chance to to zoom in and paint really close and big, especially for a landscape like this. It's a small landscape, and I think you can convey a lot with a couple of dots and dabs and marks. And I think that's, to me, in a sense, represents looser painting, when you can represent something real with strokes. And so I tend to often look at what I'm doing before I paint and translate it onto paper as, what is the shape of this stroke and what direction is it moving in? And then I look back and I kind of look at my composition as a standalone piece without the reference photo, and I look at it and I think, does this corner need a little bit more detail? Where's the focus? Kind of where does there need to be more information here? And I think I said before, a lot of that focus is on the horizon line. Once I started to add in the foreground, I realized, there's a bunch of detail in the foreground too. So maybe it allows the eye to travel around. I think some of my favorite parts, and I think the part that I spend the most time on, is typically here at the end on these little details. And I think I spend way too long on them. I think I could probably get away with doing less of this timid brushstroke thing, these tiny little brushstrokes. It's because, in all honesty, I'm not sure if I'm done. But at some point, you just have to call it. And so I found that point somewhere along the way, and I decided this piece was finished. So this is where I called it, and I decided to take the tape off and finish it up. This page is actually part of my Artful August sketchbook. So if you'd like to see the full sketchbook and maybe get some more inspiration for filling your own, make sure to check out the video. I'll link it here for you. And thank you so much for watching and spending some time painting with me today.